Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the astrology of March of 2022. Joining me today are astrologers Austin Coppock and special guest co-host Christopher Renstrom. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hey-ho.
Thank you for joining me today. All right, so I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the major astrology of March right here at the beginning, and then afterwards we'll do more extended introductions and announcements, and then we'll jump into a deep dive of the astrology of March. How does that sound to you two?
Fabulous.
I think that'll work.
All right, let's do it. So here is the planetary alignments calendar for March of 2022 that shows some of the major astrological alignments. So at the very start of the month, we begin with a kind of positive Pisces new moon, which is conjunct Jupiter on March 2nd. Then a few days later over the weekend, both Venus and Mars simultaneously move into the sign of Aquarius and depart from the sign of Capricorn, where they've been for quite some time. And they form the second conjunction that they've formed over the course of the past few weeks. Then a few days later, Mercury moves into Pisces on the 9th of March. The following week, we get a Virgo new moon on the 18th. Then the sun ingresses into Aries on the 20th. And finally, towards the end of the month, Mercury will move into the sign of Aries as well on the 27th. So those are the major alignments, more or less the sort of general outlines of the month. And we'll get into more of a deep dive of some of the more specific aspects going on over the course of the next hour or two. So, hey, welcome, guys. So welcome, Christopher. This is your first time joining us to co-host a forecast episode. So thanks for joining us today.
What an honor and a privilege. And thank you so much for having me. It's exciting.
Yeah, so you're the author of a recent book titled The Cosmic Calendar, Using Astrology to Get in Sync with Your Best Life, which I love that title. And this is an amazing book that really focuses on the planets and delineating planetary placements, especially in the birth chart and in different signs of the zodiac, right?
Absolutely. And it ties it into the idea of using your own astrological chart as a personal calendar.
Brilliant. All right. And your website is rulingplanets.com. And you, of course, regularly do month-ahead forecasts and weekly forecasts on the Astrology Hub YouTube channel, right?
Lots of forecasts for Astrology Hub. Always forecasting.
Cool. And Austin, how are you doing this month?
Oh, pretty good. It's been busy. A lot of pieces and parts moving around. Seems to be the general quality of things. I was saying to you the other day, boy, things, this year's gotten off to a pretty loud start.
Yeah, things are moving very fast in a certain direction. And there's been a lot of tensions with that Venus-Mars conjunction that happened this month and that we'll see a continuation of into next month, as we'll get into.
Yeah, I know so plenty of that, but also I think with Jupiter being so strong, I'm seeing a lot of people will suddenly full of big plans, full of big excitement and enthusiasm. Seeing a lot of things where it's like, is that a Jupiter thing or is that a Jupiter-Neptune thing, right? Is that going to be a big win or is it going to be the idea of a big win? But, kind of all mixed up together with that Venus-Mars. It's just... everywhere I look, things are moving.
For sure. All right. Well, we'll get into that a little bit more detail here in just a minute. I did want to make an announcement. So our editor of 7 years, Stephen Coppock, who's actually Austin's brother, and that's how I was introduced to him back in 2015, around the time that we started doing these forecast episodes. Stephen's been editing every episode of the Astrology Podcast and cleaning up the audio, as well as doing the video once we transitioned into doing video in 2017 or so. And he's actually departing because he's moving on to bigger and better things, which is actually kind of exciting. But it means that we're now looking for a new audio and video editor for the Astrology Podcast. So I wanted to put out an announcement, first thanking Stephen, because Stephen's been amazing and he's helped us to grow to get to the podcast to where it is today. So we owe him a lot of thanks. And I just wanted to give a round of applause for Stephen for all his work over the past 7 years and wish him, good luck in the future.
Yeah.
But so that's one point. And the other point is I need a new editor. So I'm putting out an open call. So if you'd like to, I'm looking for somebody that especially specializes in audio and cleaning up long form audio dialogues between two or more people, and that being the main specialty or focus. And then secondarily, if possible, somebody that can also do some editing on video secondarily. So if you would like to send in a resume and an introductory letter to introduce yourself and tell us why you might be a good applicant for this job, then send me an email to my assistant at theastrologypodcast@gmail.com. And there's so many applications that I may not be able to get back to everybody, but with any luck, we'll be able to find a new editor and move into whatever the new phase of the podcast is over the next 7 years. All right, so that is that announcement. Why don't we jump into looking at the astrology for March then, and talking about what's going to be going on over the course of the next few weeks. So here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will begin at the start of the month and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the month. And as we can see here, most of the activity this month is really taking place in the signs of Aquarius, where we have Venus, Mars, and Saturn, and to some extent Mercury transiting. And then the other sign where we have a lot of activity is Pisces, where we have the Sun, Jupiter, and Neptune, and a new moon taking place in that sign over the course of the next few weeks. So that gives you kind of an idea, especially if people are thinking about their birth charts, of the sector of your chart that's going to be the most activated this month. So in catching up and opening up with the astrology of March, is there anything we should review from the past month, or anything that worked out really well, or anything that caught you guys by surprise?
Are you asking about an event, or are you asking about what we think is an important planetary development?
Just sometimes we check in of things that we sort of predicted or talked about in the last forecast for February, and how things ended up working out once we lived through those events. So for me, one of the things that we were really focused on was the Venus-Mars conjunction that was going to occur February 16th. And we tied that in, especially towards the end of the last episode, to the situation that was happening between Russia and Ukraine. And we're thinking that if there was going to be a conflict, that it would start around that time. And that ended up working out pretty well. It was actually kind of weird because for a few days there, about a week before that, the United States was issuing a statement saying that they thought the invasion was going to take place on the 16th of February, which is actually right when the Venus-Mars conjunction took place. And it didn't end up happening right then, but then within a few days of that, it seems like Russia has officially annexed or recognized 2 breakaway territories in the Ukraine and have started sending in troops. So whatever's happening with that situation has now officially begun not too far after the Mars-Venus conjunction. How did you feel about that, Austin, or what was your take on some of that?
Yeah, well, so it was very clearly timed to that Mars-Venus co-presence, them moving together through Capricorn. As I was saying to you the other day, when we did the yearly, I saw a lot of Mars this year, and I expected a lot of saber rattling and maybe saber drawing. But as I was saying to you, I'm a little surprised it's this Marsy this quickly. I was sort of, and still am waiting to see what the Mars and Aries period, which is May, June, what that looks like, because that looked very excited. Very excited about conquering on a very positive personal level and a less positive international relations level. So I was a little surprised that it got moving in this direction as quickly as it did.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, you had an exalted Mars in Capricorn, so exalted Mars in Capricorn, it happens every 2 years or whatever. But I think what we also sort of need to note here is that, if I'm looking at this correctly, this is the last time that Mars will conjoin Pluto in Capricorn in our lifetimes.
Is that true?
Yeah, because Mars and Pluto never conjoin again. Mars doesn't catch up to Pluto again before Pluto leaves. So this is kind of like the last hurrah of this exalted Mars and Pluto conjunction, which is taking place on March 3rd, along with the Venus conjunction. So this is the last time Mars and Pluto are together in a sign that Mars is exalted in. So, I mean, I had my fingers crossed that the Jupiter-Uranus sextile might prevail. I was kind of like hoping for that one, but that conjunction, that last conjunction of Mars and Pluto is it's very, very strong.
That's such a good point.
That's one of the aspects coming up, and that happens also very close to Venus, is finally going to leave its shadow, where it's been the point where it originally went retrograde at in December. It's going to reach that point right on March 1st, which basically marks the end of the Venus retrograde post-shadow period. So we're still getting out of some of that Venus retrograde stuff. And it was interesting that the Russia's announcement just a few days ago happened, I think, almost exactly 8 years after the anniversary of the annexation of the Crimea. So it was very much tied in with that 8-year Venus retrograde cycle. And those 8-year anniversaries can sometimes be very potent, especially when you throw other planets into the mix, like Mars in that conjunction at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. And I also wonder whether the nature is going to be different anyway. The Venus-Mars conjunction in Capricorn is not going to be the same thing as the Venus-Mars conjunction in Aquarius, although they share the common denominator of Saturn as the ruler. But I kind of feel like that's going to be a tone change. You know, that Capricorn energy is one tone, but then the conjunction in Aquarius is going to be a different tone. Maybe war fought on a different level. In terms of not just sanctions, but, you know, what they're really talking about, which is rolling out, you know, freezing assets, banking, things that are going to really affect the world financial markets in a very radical way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to spend some time talking about the condition change for Mars and Venus, because that is probably the biggest configuration in March. Is Mars and Venus's nearly simultaneous ingress into Aquarius and then moving together through Aquarius for the entirety of the month. Mm-hmm. And so in Capricorn exalts, privileges Mars. It's a very strong place for Mars. And Venus has triplicity dignity in Capricorn. Venus does just fine in Capricorn, but it's not a place of huge strength. And when two planets are put into a position where they're, where they want different things, right? You got to look at who's capable of getting their way. Or which one is going to get their way when they disagree. Obviously, on the things that they agree on, you don't need to worry about that. But Capricorn is great place for Mars, not so great for Venus. Whereas Aquarius, when they move into Aquarius, they'll be sharing the sign with Saturn, who's the ruler of Aquarius. So they're both going to be under the thumb. And neither Venus nor Mars has much essential dignity in Aquarius.
Right.
Venus has the first decan, and there's, each of them has a bound, but nobody's really got a lot of strength, whereas Saturn's just obviously in control there. And so this, this conjunction, this mobile conjunction, which has been very Mars-led up to this point, will change significantly because both, Saturn's coming to discipline both Mars and Venus.
Calm down, kids. 3 feet apart.
Get with the program.
They're kind of fighting with each other and going back and forth. First, Mars conjoining Venus on February 16th, and then later Venus will catch up to and sort of tag Mars on the 6th of March once they move into Aquarius. But then eventually later they'll both run into Saturn, and then, that'll kind of put the brakes on things, hopefully.
Well, they've got a square to Uranus mid-month. They're both going to be squaring Uranus, so that's going to be. I think there's going to be a little bit more of a food fight before Saturn, tells the kids to calm down and sit on their hands.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been watching for years now. We've been watching Mars activate the Uranus-Saturn square. We watched that all last year. Whenever there was a hard angle, we got fireworks. Actually, in July, we literally got fireworks at a record number of disasters. But this is, Mars coming back to Aquarius is independent of this very intriguing mobile Venus-Mars conjunction. It's also Mars back in a fixed sign, hard angle to Uranus, and then conjunction in this case with Saturn. right? And so whenever we've had Mars in a fixed sign, pinging that square, it's a little looser now, but it's with it. They're both middle decan of their signs. They're not an infinity away. Where we should be seeing more of the Saturn Uranus stuff, but with Venus involved, which makes it more complicated.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things that's a little weird as well is that this Venus-Mars conjunction happens at 0 degrees of Aquarius, which was a sensitive degree when it came to the pandemic over the past couple of years. First, with that initial Mars-Saturn conjunction that happened in the early phases of the lockdowns in March and April of 2020, that Mars-Saturn conjunction occurred at 0 degrees of Aquarius, or very early in Aquarius. And then later, after about a year, in December of 2020, we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which occurred at the very beginning of Aquarius, at like 0 Aquarius. And that was when the vaccines were first introduced or rolled out to the public, which seemed to start rolling back the pandemic, at least for some people. So here we have some sort of follow-up connection of another set of planets forming an exact and an important conjunction at that degree. And I wonder if that's not also somehow connected to the pandemic and another sort of turning point in terms of the pandemic, since we're also not far away from Mars moving into Aquarius. Also marks the first time that Mars has returned back to the same sign as Saturn in 2 years. So taking us back to the early phases of the pandemic and the lockdowns back in 2020, and ramping up for that exact conjunction that will occur in early April, which will mark the end of 1, 2, or 2.5 year cycle of Mars and Saturn that started at the beginning of the pandemic, and the wrapping down or closing down of some themes, but then also the start of a new cycle and the beginning of some new ones related to that.
And Chris, what was that degree that you were referencing again?
0 Aquarius?
Yeah, what I think I was remembering correctly is that Mars and Uranus square each other right when Uranus enters Taurus in 2018. In fact, Mars is at 0 Aquarius. I think maybe it's a day after Uranus enters Taurus. So the first aspect that's made is that when Uranus enters Taurus is to square Mars in Aquarius. So perhaps that might be suggesting that, that's a sensitive degree or sort of landmine, as you will, waiting to be stepped on. It might be particularly volatile. That's what I thought of when you mentioned that degree.
So I wanted to jump in on that, Chris, because there's a lot there about coming about the Saturn-Mars cycle resetting, right? When we talked about this a little bit last month, and I think I referred to it as like a new moon for horror or difficult things, right? That's the slow synodic cycle which involves both malefics and kind of gives us a seed point for the challenges, difficulty, the sufferings of a given period of time. And the last one really did kind of set up the last 2 years, right? It was end of March, early April of 2020. And, certainly there were rumblings and concerns and things that started to happen earlier in March. But by the time we got that Mars-Saturn conjunction, it was like, oh, okay, this is going to be a thing, right? This isn't going away. And so it's really interesting to think in terms of what does that new cycle look like? And so I was thinking about Aquarius because we've got 4 planets in Aquarius for part of the month and at least 3 for a lot of the month. And randomly, I was explaining Terminator 2 to a Zoomer who'd never seen Terminator 2, because I made a reference to liquid metal and this and that.
Sacrilege. How could you not have seen Terminator 2?
I know. They're like, oh, this is really interesting. I was like, yeah, I thought everybody saw it. But anyway, the point is, I was like, oh, Terminator 2 was a Saturn and Aquarius movie. And it's so full of anxiety about possible futures. Like literally the plot is things have already gone in a horrible techno dystopian direction. And it's literally people from the bad timeline, the dystopia, sending robots back to the present, which is the 90s, to try to correct the timeline. And I was just thinking, I was like, oh God, this whole time with Saturn and Aquarius, the omnipresence of possible dystopias has just dominated people's thinking, including mine. It's like, oh God, but if this happens and it goes in that direction, then we'll be living in this kind of world. And there are 30 different kinds of that thinking. But anyway, the sort of coming back to a sort of, okay, we're here now and nobody knows what they're doing, or what do we do? What do we build out of the wreckage? Do we rebuild things? Do we build them differently? Like coming back to the okay, now we're in, I don't know, almost a crossroads between dystopias.
Yeah. I mean, one of the optimistic points about that, though, is especially now that Mars is getting towards the end of Capricorn, because that transit had just been whipping up and reactivating parts of people's charts that were activated at the very beginning of the pandemic when Mars first went through Capricorn and joined that stellium between like February and April of 2020. And so that, and then over the course of the next month or so, as Mars moves through Aquarius and eventually joins up with Saturn, is just reactivating some of those parts of the chart that were first sort of churned up a couple of years ago during the first and early second quarter of 2020, during the early phases of the pandemic. But that time when that happened, it was kind of new. And that was like the first time that had happened, that you'd had that kind of tough pileup of planets in that sector of the chart. And I think it opened up a lot of difficult things in certain areas of people's lives. But now that some of that energy's come back around, even though it's returning us to some of that, and some of those problems might be coming up a bit again in certain parts of people's lives, doing it the second time, I feel like is a little bit easier, and people are maybe a little bit more prepared, where if some of those issues arise again, they might know how to deal with it a little bit better than they did last time.
Okay, but I mean, we've had the section of the chart you're talking about with planetary pileup is the Capricorn Saturn, right? Is that what you're referencing?
Is Capricorn and Aquarius.
Capricorn Aquarius, yeah, thank you. Well, we had this 30 years ago. We had Neptune and Uranus in Capricorn, along with Saturn. So, and that's the 1997 fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, I don't even give it Saturn and Capricorn 2 years. I mean, Saturn's doing Saturn sign, so you really give it 4 years, whenever you're dealing with this part of the chart. I mean, Saturn's going through the 2 Saturn signs, which happen to be back to back with each other. So we're literally doing a Saturn return on that period of time. And we happen to have, it's a very similar congestion or collection of planets there. And on that go around, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. On that go around, it was Rodney King. On that go around, it was apartheid being deconstructed. And on that go around, it wasn't COVID, it was AIDS, that was making people not touch people and, backing off and away. So there is very much a repetition of themes that are taking place. And, speaking as someone who was like living during that time, there was an expectation that on this time, we would be smarter about it. And it was like, wow, we're reacting pretty much the same time, in the same way that we did back then. If anything, this time a bit ruder, but yeah, we've been down this road before, and just happened to be like 28, 30 years ago, but we've been down this road before.
Sure. Right. Yeah. So why don't something that is optimistic to me is that first new moon of the month. So I'd like to take a look at that with you guys, because I think might give us the ability to look at the other column this month. I know when you and I were talking, Christopher, you said that things are very much grouped into 2 columns this month. There's the Saturn column with everything in Capricorn and Aquarius, but then there's this other very distinct other side of Jupiter in Pisces, and the Pisces column, which is a little bit more optimistic in that part of people's lives. So let me pull up
Yeah, I think it's pretty stark. It's not just like a little friend layer. It's like full on big good versus full on rough and tough, you know?
Well, but it depends on the way that you're looking at it because, you've got Saturn in its own sign and that's a column. You've got Jupiter in its own sign and that's a column. But, Saturn is, even though Saturn's called a malefic, there are some extraordinary things that take place under Saturn or Saturn types of energies. And one of them actually happens to be the reconstruction of society. I mean, we saw that taking place with the dissolution of the Soviet Union 28 years ago. I mean, it didn't turn out great, but that's what was going on. There was an attempt to do that. There was an attempt to avoid that dystopian scenario and to create a utopian one that was very much in the air during
Absolutely.
that time.
It's less about just Saturn. It's the both Mars and Saturn. Because Mars doesn't bring out the best behavior from Saturn, and Saturn doesn't generally bring out the best behavior from Mars. And they're both willing to fight dirty when they disagree.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're like biker buddies at the bar, right? They're the two badasses.
Or I don't know. It's a little bit more cops and robbers with Saturn and Mars, I think. But which they're playing the same game, but that game has very defined sides most of the time.
Yeah.
All right, so here is the calendar again, just to show the date that new moon falls right at the start of the month on the 2nd of March. So let's look at the actual chart for that. Here it is. So the new moon takes place towards the middle of the day or earlier in the morning on March 2nd. It occurs and goes exact at 12 degrees of Pisces. And one of the things I like about that is that immediately after that conjunction takes place, both of the luminaries then apply directly to a conjunction with Jupiter, which is just 2 degrees away at 14 degrees of Pisces. So there's some optimism to that new moon in terms of that conjunction with Jupiter, although we also see a very intense energy of Venus, Mars, and Pluto all conjoined around the 27th degree of Capricorn, which is kind of a tense energy. And then also a super hyper-focused Mercury conjunct Saturn at 18 degrees of Aquarius almost simultaneously. So this is one of the standout alignments for me in 2022 because it's this very interesting triple set of conjunctions of 3 planets conjoined in Pisces, 2 planets conjoined in Aquarius, and then 3 planets very closely conjoined in Capricorn, which is kind of a unique thing that stands out and catches your eye as an astrologer when you have 3 different sets of planets all aligning perfectly in the sky on the same day.
And that's something I think we always have to remember. It's like things can look very, pessimistic and they can look very, dreary, but they don't, that's not our day-to-day life. A lot of times the mood or the perspective of the worldview can change. And this is something that astrology is always teaching us, is that the changing of the guard of the planets, the different aspects that they make, change and adjust our view and our lens and the way that we look at things and what's going on. So, it's never just, that's the end. Life doesn't work like that, and astrology doesn't work like that. And that's a lovely new moon that's taking place with the aspects that are applying towards Jupiter. I like Jupiter in Jupiter-ruled signs. It makes me think so much of the liturgical calendar. The Jupiter-ruled signs, when you look at the liturgical calendar, are the most holy times of year. Okay, they're the times when you are closest to God or when you are anticipating God. You have Sagittarius in front of Capricorn, so you have Advent, okay, which takes place when the sun is in Sagittarius. And then you have, when the sun is in Pisces, you have Lent. Advent, of course, is anticipating the birth of Christ. And Lent, of course, is anticipating the resurrection or the rebirth. So there's a lot of anticipation, looking forward energy that's connected to Jupiter, which I think sort of shows up in the Jupiter personalities, where they can sometimes be more into the anticipation, or the waiting for something, rather than the actual arrival or the end result. It's kind of like, it was so much more exciting when we were anticipating this. And then now that it's happened, like, oh, that's all there is to a circus, type of thing, the Peggy Lee song. So So I think there's something that when Jupiter is in its own sign, there's a sort of divinity, or there's a expectation of divinity, looking forward to, anticipating that I think is very, very powerful. And I think that kind of plays into the mindset during that period of time. At least, in the liturgical calendar, that's what's celebrated during those times of year.
That's really interesting. I hadn't connected anticipation to Jupiter. And so those periods of time in the liturgical calendar are also times of preparing oneself and one's life for the divine. It's not if you're doing it right. It's not merely being like, oh, it's going to be great, it's coming. It's doing a practice in both cases in order to prepare in anticipation. I think that's a really nice way to think about it. And of course, Jupiter has just religious observance of all types as a signification from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think that and Jupiter carries with it moral values. That used to have a very negative term, or it used to have a very negative flavor. This moral justice, who's deciding what's right and what's wrong, and things like that. But I think that what Jupiter carries, Jupiter strong in a chart, I feel has a very strong sense of a moral universe. That this is not a universe of chaos. This is not, God is not math. And with the Jupiter sensibility, there's a belief or resonating with a moral universe that there's good and bad in the universe, and you actually can play a role where you can bring about good. This is why when we look at Jupiter, we say, oh, we expect good things. It's not winning the lottery. We expect, or we want, or we prepare, as you said, Austin, to be instruments or people who change the course, in a more moral or a more good direction. That's kind of like the gist of it. Whether it turns out that way or not is, anyone's guess and look at history, but that is at least the hope, and I think Jupiter is very much, I can never decide whether Jupiter's hope or Neptune's hope. I go back and forth on that. When you were talking earlier, Austin, about sort of distinguishing the difference between Jupiter and Neptune, like, oh, that's going to be interesting in Pisces. But I think that there's very much an optimistic or a hopeful quality that's connected to Jupiter. There's a belief in good. And I think that resonates when Jupiter is in its own signs.
Yeah, I think hope and optimism are really great keywords, especially for this new moon and for this conjunction, just because this is also going to be just 2 days later, the Jupiter-Sun cazimi, where the Sun conjoins Jupiter, which also means that it's moving very fast. It's at its fastest at this point in terms of planetary speed, and it's just cruising through one of its home signs of Pisces, and is not going to stay there for long. But that means that this also represents not just a lunation or a new moon between the sun and moon, but also kind of like new cycle between the sun and Jupiter in terms of their synodic cycle as well. And so to me, this is when Jupiter really starts to get going and starts to emerge and come into its power in its home sign of Pisces. So I know a lot of us were looking forward to the ingress, which took place a while ago now, or several weeks ago now. But I think this new moon taking place in Pisces is going to be the breath of fresh air and breath of hope and optimism for something more positive to come, and that we're moving into a new phase of things after emerging from the past 2, almost 3 years now of Jupiter moving through Aquarius and Capricorn. It's been since late 2019 since Jupiter was in Sagittarius, its other home sign, and so much has changed. And it seems like we've gone through not just the winter of the past few months, but the winter of the past couple of years with the pandemic. And there's something very hopeful and optimistic about seeing a light at the end of the tunnel with this new moon that's taking place at the beginning of March.
Yeah, absolutely. It's lovely. And I wanted to respond to a few of the things about Jupiter. So, as you know, there's the term hope is used, and that's certainly appropriate. As somebody with Jupiter on the degree of the rising, what I experience with Jupiter is a belief, a deep belief that things can be improved. Like, I almost never feel like there's nothing that can be done. I don't necessarily think everything can sort of all problems can be erased. But I believe I've always believed there's something we can do about this, or there's something I can do about this. Maybe I don't know what that is, but there's an answer out there somewhere, which is different than hoping that things will just work out for me. It's a little like I really like. I'm really kind of positively stuck on the example you gave earlier, Christopher, where there's the anticipation, but are you doing the preparation? Are you preparing the ground for it? I also think in terms of with Jupiter, there's long-term success, right? Like it's success that takes 12 years as opposed to like a quick win or an amazing weekend or whatever, the, more swiftly moving Venus cycle. And just one more thing, Chris, to add to what you were saying about the new moon and then the Jupiter Sun conjunction just a few days later on my soul return. That's also Jupiter switching from evening rising to morning rising, and all of the bedrock texts consider Jupiter to be strongest in morning rising rather than evening rising. So just on a technical level, it's Jupiter moving into its most powerful phase in its own sign.
Yeah, I love that. So one of our keywords then also with this might be to think about is sort of the power of faith and optimism sometimes to not just carry you through the hard times, but also in order to achieve what you want through almost like visualizing or manifesting it. But part of the necessary prerequisite to that, which for some people can be hard to really get down, is having some sort of internal sense of belief or faith that you can get there, or that you can manifest that positive future in some way, or bring that about. But you have to sort of have the faith or the belief in that in order to pull it off sometimes, which almost sounds contradictory, but sometimes that's how Jupiterian people work, is just by this sheer power of belief in themselves sometimes, and then being able to turn that into reality.
Well, I think testing of the faith is such an important thing for Jupiter. When you were bringing up how Jupiter was in Sagittarius, what's fascinating is that Sagittarius is the last of the fire signs before we enter the spring, Aries, right? So Sagittarius is almost when, the sun is setting, it's going into winter. And so it goes from being, this open fire to like a candle. It's like a votive candle, almost in a way, that Sagittarius is going to have to carry this faith through the darkness of winter, before the sun returns, with Aries. Faith and belief, you go back and forth in the different meanings and nuances between the two, but testing of faith is such a elemental part of faith. The flip side of faith obviously is doubt, and so you've got Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter faith, Saturn doubt, but doubt and things that test the faith are also the things that get you to become more moral. It gets you to become more in touch with your conscience, whatever your conscience will be, and sometimes, you might line up with your church or your scripture or your way of believing, and sometimes you might not. You might become the heretic, you might become the mystic, you might become the outsider, and that's kind of the relationship also between Sagittarius and Pisces. So that thing of testing faith in yourself, or what do we keep hearing right now? Faith in democracy, like democracy is in danger right now. Faith in, the experiment of democracy, faith in the world view. This is something that's being critically tested right now, and each of us is going to be answering that within ourselves.
Yeah. And it also makes me think of a discussion that we had, Austin, in the Astrology and Magic episode, about something I found really interesting about the idea of magic was that one of the prerequisites that you needed to have in order to actualize your will was a belief that you could do it. and a sort of casting away of doubt in some ways seemed like a necessary like ingredient.
I don't think that's crucial it depends on what kind of magic you're doing. I would say that it's less important to be certain and have faith that it's going to work. It is, however, important to not constantly sabotage your process with doubt. Like the absence of doubt doesn't necessarily mean the presence of faith. You can, the Picatrix, for example, often refers to it as an experimental art. Like do this and see what happens. I think that you can come at it, especially that Picatrixian style. You can definitely come at it with a mercurial quality of curiosity. Well, if I do this and I say these words and I do this thing and I cut into this stone, like I want to see what happens. I was very like when I was first doing experiments, I was really curious. I didn't know exactly what would happen. I didn't, I wasn't certain. But yeah. But there's certainly some forms where faith or devotion is very important. But there's also a lot of, Mercury as like the magician and trickster is also a thing. I think the more how should we say, divinely or theurgical the magic, the more Jupiter and faith comes in. When you're doing like a devotion, for me, I'm doing like I did like a 2-hour a night devotional practice to Kali last summer, right? Like that was much more Jupiterian and much more, I don't like the word faith, but it's probably because I grew up in the Bible Belt.
Right. It's time to take it back. It's time to take it back. Re-own that word, repossess it. Because when we're in the realm of Jupiter, we're in a very different realm than Mercury. There's a reason why these signs are opposite, the planets are opposite each other in rulership. Mercury is curiosity, it's investigation, it's trying to figure things out. When we're in the realm of Jupiter, we're in the realm of wonder. We're in the realm of mystery, okay? And this isn't mystery like a riddle to be solved. It's the wonder of mystery. It's being transported. It's being awestruck by mystery. It's being transported by mystery. This is the realm of Jupiter. Whether it's like, whoa, that was such a great sunset. I'm so glad we took this hike, just taking the nature, that sort of Sagittarian flavor of Jupiter, whether it's just like the mystery of magic or the mystery of encounters with an invisible world, things that cannot be easily explained. This belongs to Jupiter. And this also calls for a leap of faith. Like you're not going to be able to explain it easily to someone else. You're not going to, you're going to maybe sound like a rambling idiot or something like that. But that wondrous experience of something that's mystical or something that transports you, whether it's just, witnessing beauty or witnessing a miracle, this is the realm of Jupiter.
Experiencing the holy bigness.
Mm-hmm.
That was something we talked about in the Hermeticism episode this month, was the Hermeticism was supposed to be based on a revealed wisdom or knowledge about the totality and the truth of the cosmos and how it works in some sense. And it was like revealed from a teacher to a student. And then Hermeticism sets up this chain of passing down that knowledge from teacher to student, unbroken, ideally, for as long as possible. But it's that personal experiential touch with seeing something bigger and seeing the totality of things and seeing some truth or some like just ultimately true statement about the nature of the cosmos.
You're seeing God. You're seeing God. You're seeing the divine, something that, and if you look at the Kabbalah, just the incantations, the nonsensical incantations, but to go and to elevate to a point where you can stand in the throne world of the divine. I mean, these are things that are actually, I would ascribe even more to Pisces, because Pisces, you start getting into the invisible world. I mean, I imagine you guys probably don't work with Neptune as a co-ruler of Pisces, and that's its own thing, but I do. And I think that, what's helpful with Neptune as a co-ruler of Pisces is that you get Jupiter, which is beyond the blue horizon, and then you get Neptune, which is beyond that blue horizon. It gets into the realm of the invisible. It gets into the realm of things that cannot be easily explained, but there's no refuting the experience. And this is what all the mystics talk about. No matter how much gibberish they're spouting, or people are like, I want to understand, but I don't get what you're describing. They're almost like, if you read like Teresa of Avila or Catherine of Siena, they can almost be interchangeable with people who are trying to describe alien abductions. They just sound so ridiculous, or what their experience is so exotic and so bizarre. But yet there was something about their messaging that really moved the hearts and souls of people. And this is something that belongs to Pisces, the ability to move the waters in someone else's unconscious or in someone else's soul, but again, what makes it so Pisces, is that it goes back to the mysterious and the things that are hard to explain or catalog.
Yeah, and it's hard to, with regards to rulership, with this conjunction being within 10 degrees of Neptune there at 22 Pisces, like all of the keywords we're using are very much tied into that conjunction with Neptune this month, and the impending conjunction between Jupiter and Neptune, which is, while it doesn't go exact until early next month, it's very much looming large on the stage at this point in a lot of the discussion that we're having here.
Yeah, you can see the Neptune entangling into our discussion about Jupiter.
Yeah. So I wanted to really quickly draw out some other keywords from other placements that are tied in with this and see if you guys could throw some keywords out for me. So one of them, Christopher, I know you liked, was the sextile to Uranus at 11 degrees of Taurus, sextiling the new moon at 12 degrees of Pisces. Yeah. What element does that sextile give, or what keywords would you throw out into the mix?
My feeling about that is Uranus is usually associated to revolution and change, the overthrow. But I think that when it cooperates with Jupiter, which is how I see that sextile, and so it's coming away from that energy. We see the sextile energy there with Uranus with the Sun. My feeling is that we switch from revolution to reform, to reformation. To the idea of reforming so instead of overthrowing the structure that's in place, we take that structure and we rework it, maybe because we don't have a choice, or it's a necessary evil, or, let's just reform it and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, whatever. But I think Uranus changes its disposition to the idea of a reforming. So let's see what we can do to rearrange the pieces in this to make it work better, And so I actually I love sextiles, I think that they may not be dramatic like their other aspects, but there's a sort of brokering of the energies that takes place with the sextiles. They're kind of acting as go-betweens. With the planets, having the conversations that are taking place off stage, And so I see this as maybe a reforming. And so, for people in your regular day-to-day lives, you may be facing situations where it's like, I should take a much more dramatic action, or I should walk out on this, or I should overthrow, or whatever. And it might be like, well, I don't know if that's going to work, but I wonder what I can do to change the pieces or the different aspects of the situation to make it better and also more livable. So that's why I actually look at this very hopefully, looking at this sextile energy.
Yeah, it's a inferior sextile, so it's just a nice little added spice of throwing in some innovation, some trying something new to the otherwise optimistic thing, and I think is a helpful little boost to the already kind of hopeful conjunction that we have going on there. The other keywords I was looking for is Mercury-Saturn conjunct in Aquarius occurring at the same time. What are some of your keywords, Austin, for Mercury conjunct Saturn in Aquarius, or what does that bring to mind for you?
Well, from a Saturn perspective, if Saturn Saturn represents the structural challenges and pressures of a time period, having Mercury inspect those is really useful in terms of diagnosing, instead of having a general anxiety about things, looking with precision at what the situation is and really making it thinkable, right? Like, let's say Aquarius is your second house and there's money trouble, right? But there's a huge difference between worrying about money and like sitting down, looking at exactly where it's going, where it's coming in, like getting that, getting the full report from Mercury as accountant and scribe. And then from Mercury's perspective, Saturn provides, Saturn provides discipline, structure, concentration. It can pull the thinking into sort of a negative or depressive direction. But with Saturn being, with both of them are relatively happy in Aquarius, right? It's not a sign that Mercury rules, but it's hardly an unfamiliar place, and they are in a Mercury ruled decan. I think there's a really good opportunity to think coldly. There may be, because it's occurring at the same time as the Sun, Moon, Jupiter, there may be, as we say, a buoyancy to the soul, or to, just expectations and, sense of the time. But Mercury, Saturn here, I think really will help us think coldly, like think without hope. We can feel buoyed, but then, some things need to be addressed with a less than room temperature thinking.
Yeah, a soberness of thought and a succinctness in terms of speech are the two main keywords I was thinking of, that even though we have the hopefulness and the idealism of the Pisces stellium that's going on, like you said, it sort of in our soul or in terms of the new beginnings and the hopefulness of that, there's still a sober thoughtfulness that's taking place that is a little bit more grounded and a little bit more realistic with the Mercury-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And then the last energy that I really wanted to see if we could try to encapsulate that is tied in with this new moon is that triple conjunction of Venus, Mars, and Pluto.
I also see that Mercury-Saturn conjunction as being called to the principal's office, and so, it's like, getting called forward to explain yourself. But I also feel like the principal Saturn has seen this Mercury before. So it's like a scamp, type of thing. So there's a sort of good humored, exchange that's taking place, but it's definitely, you want to keep your eye on the technicalities, the details. There's no pulling a fast one with whenever Mercury is next to Saturn. But I wanted to sort of also increase that sort of like good humored, or how are you going to talk your way out of this one Mercury type of energy that was going on there.
Right, for sure. So, and then finally with the the Venus-Mars-Pluto conjunction, this is, of course, taking us back a little bit to some of the energy that we were experiencing a few months ago when Venus stationed retrograde at 26 degrees of Capricorn, I believe back in December, and it was closely conjunct Pluto. And so there was this intensity to some of the relationship dynamics that were being brought up at the time. Since it was a retrograde, it was sometimes bringing up things from the past that were very intense or sometimes kind of difficult to deal with, but in many instances that needed to be dredged up for some reason. And here we have Venus just leaving finally its shadow, passing 26 degrees and finally moving into new territory, but again, running into Pluto or finding Pluto again during the process. But at this point, Mars has joined up at the same time, which is adding sort of an intense, almost like conflict type energy at the same time. And this tension between Venus and Mars of union versus division, or, war versus peace is one of the other major keywords of Venus and Mars we've been seeing play out this month. Action versus holding back and reaction. What are some of our other keywords for Venus, Mars, and Pluto conjoined at 27 degrees here in Capricorn?
Well, there's a Faustian bargain that's involved when you're dealing with Pluto here. There were agreements that were made in order to move forward. So I think that, Mars is kind of straightforward. I mean, Mars is kind of climbed up onto a precipice. It's Mars in Capricorn, right? It's climbed up to a precipice. It's really in a position where it has to assert itself very loudly and very visibly. Okay, so that's what's getting excited in Mars. I think Venus is so Mars is like, am I pushing hard enough for this? Maybe I should push more.
So Mars is maybe the loudest voice there in that conjunction. It's being amplified by Pluto and amplified by the fact that it's in its sign of exaltation.
Well, and it's in its singular degree of exaltation.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, there you have it.
That 28th degree, 27 is the it's the single degree.
And I think Venus always has an eye on what the cost is going to be. You know, you don't get rich going to war. Okay. That's one of the reasons why Venus and Jupiter are benefics. You have prosperity and good business in times of peace. You don't have it going on in times of war. You know, so I kind of feel like this Venus-Pluto conjunction is really leading into the conjunction with Mars and Aquarius is really kind of a look at the contract. It's a look at the pledge. Venus is about betrothals. It's about pledges. It's about the agreements that you make. And so here, I think Venus is almost taking account of what the cost of that is going to be. So, if Venus is holding back, it's only because she's being more strategic than Mars at this point and probably trying to figure out how do you help someone climb down from on top of the bar after they've yelled at everyone, at the top of their lungs, and how do you help them climb down from on top of the bar and save face? So I would kind of take it in that kind of a direction.
Yeah, Venus might be trying to hold Mars back at this point, but probably isn't going to be super successful just because Pluto and being on that exaltation degree is empowering Mars and the tendency for conflict or for war in the worst case scenario, or strife or separation being empowered. I often think I always remember this one chart of somebody that had a Mars-Pluto conjunction in the 12th house, and they would just explode sometimes in anger, fury over their perceived enemies, which is a 12th house topic. And I always just think of Mars or Pluto as empowering and taking small things and making them bigger, like Alan White always used to say. And if Mars's primary principle is anger or strife or division, then in some ways that's what's being kind of pumped up and made much larger and much bigger than it would be otherwise at this point. And Venus probably isn't super successful, at least at this stage, at the very beginning of March, in holding that back. But we'll see what happens once they change signs and move into Aquarius and Venus catches up to and finally conjoins Mars and both of them get free of Pluto.
Venus can be a very strategic planet. Okay. Venus, the holding back can also mean letting the person have their screaming match and then, talking to them afterwards. So you can have the moment where, the person's yelling at the bar, but then there's going to be a hangover. There's going to be what happens after that, type of thing. And I think that Venus, who is always got its eye on the bonds, the contracts, the treaties, okay, that's something that I think is very activated. And you could even make a case with the conjunction to Pluto that she's kind of maybe playing more of the long game here than Mars is.
So I would add to this. I guess both of what you both said is really interesting. There's a lot there, but what I would add is that this is really an incredibly powerful point for Mars, and that Mars it's exalted in Capricorn in large part because Mars acts so strategically in Capricorn, right? It's Mars is passionate and can be distracted, right? But in Capricorn, there's a Saturnian focus on results, which can sometimes look deeply cruel, but at the same time is being deeply effective. And so we have this Mars-Pluto in Mars's single strongest degree in the zodiac. This looks like big power moves, likely beneath the surface.
Yeah. In fact, it could actually be argued, Austin, perhaps both planets are strategic in Capricorn in their own particular ways,
And Venus may not want war, but Venus may very well want the gains from some power moves and hard bargaining.
Well, I find it interesting that with the next unfolding, of what's taking place is talk of freezing the bank accounts freezing the villas, freezing the access to your London addresses and homes and residences if you're part of, the circle. And that's a very Venusian thing, which is like these legs are now crossed. You no longer have access to, okay? And so that freezing out, could be a very Venus and Capricorn type of thing. Or, I might not be able to join the brawl at the bar, but I can take care of the purse strings, or I can turn off.
Let me jump in. I agree with the freezing. I think that's when they both move into the sign where Saturn is. I think that's where the big a lot of things freeze. And then people may not be happy with the sort of shape that gets frozen, because right now things are pretty much in motion, very in motion. More Capricorn is a cardinal sign. It initiates new things, it gets things moving, but we're just a little week and a half away from going into a fixed things where it's sort of like, you ever play freeze tag, right, where everybody's running around and it's freeze,
right? Or the Rose of Sharon moment in Squid Game, where it turns around and you better be frozen.
Yeah, with Mars-Saturn, right? Maybe it's that scene from Squid Game.
Green light, red light, right?
So I'd like to move on, but I want to mention really quickly, this is actually, for the electional chart this month, this is actually the highlighted electional date that we wanted to use as our favorite electional chart for the month, is this new moon in Pisces conjunct Jupiter. Mm-hmm. So the electional chart this month takes place on March 2nd, 2022, and you want to set your chart for about 10:45 a.m. with about the middle degrees of Gemini rising, and you want to put Mercury right on the degree of the midheaven. So this is a chart with Gemini rising, and the ruler of the ascendant is in the 9th house, having reception with its domicile lord of Saturn. So some of the soberness of thought and speech becomes part of the focal point of this electional chart, focused on the 9th house as well as 10th house matters with the midheaven conjunct Mercury. So this would be good for education, for publishing, for other types of 9th house topics, especially involving study and learning and wisdom, but also things like communication, things of that nature. So there will be some restraint and some soberness and a little bit of holding back or seriousness with that conjunction of Saturn. But in the long term, it could be positive in terms of saying things deliberately and carefully and in a way that is most effective. So it also has that super optimistic 10th house conjunction of the sun and moon applying towards Jupiter in Pisces in the 10th whole sign house, which is good for business and career matters. The area that it's not so good for is 8th house matters involving shared resources because of Mars in the 8th house in a day chart. So this is our featured auspicious selection for the month, and we actually found a bunch of electional charts this month because there's so many great Jupiter and Pisces elections during the course of March. So for the other electional charts, you can check out the Auspicious Elections podcast, which is a monthly electional astrology podcast that Lisa Scheim and I produce each month and that we just released the other day, where we featured, I think, at least 4 or 5 other electional charts during the course of March. So for more information about that, just go to patreon.com/astrology podcast, and you'll find the Auspicious Elections podcast as part of one of our tiers. So a lot of good Jupiter and Pisces elections, and you really want to take advantage of them this month because Jupiter is just cruising through Pisces over the course of this month, and it's already going to be in Aries by early May. So if you wanted to get the best out of especially some of the day chart elections with Jupiter and Pisces, then it might be time to get a hold of them while the getting is good, I think. Have you seen some of that as well? You doing some Jupiter and Pisces work, Austin?
Yeah, I was literally going to say, get while the getting's good, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's just not around for that much longer. And when it comes back for a month or so, what is it, month and a half at the end of the year, and it's like, oh, we get more Jupiter and Pisces. But it's square Mars the whole time. And so it's not the same electional candy that we currently have.
Yeah. So that's really important. And that's the electional chart for the month. Since we are about an hour to our episode, I did want to also mention our sponsor this month, which is the Zodiac Buzzed astrology-themed drinking card game, which is actually launching on Kickstarter here at the very beginning of March, very close to that electional chart that I just mentioned, where all the astrologers are trying to launch important and major projects. So I really love this project. And it's actually really funny, and it's cool seeing new ideas like this coming into the community with the influx of astrologers over the course of the past few years. So Zodiac Buzzed is an interactive drinking card game that groups players into teams according to the element of their zodiacal sign. And each element has a deck full of personalized statements, action cards, and dares based on the characteristics of the signs. So it's perfect for enthusiasts and professional astrologers to let loose and embrace their inner chaos and kind of to just let go and sort of learn more about each other and share some things in a sort of comfortable environment with friends or people you get along with, other things like that, and to incorporate and learn some astrology and learn about the different signs. So there's a water deck, a fire deck, an air deck, and an earth deck, and it's actually produced by a couple of astrologers. So this is something I wish we had at some of our early conferences, Austin, that I think we would have had fun with.
Yeah, I think we had to improvise.
Yeah, we did the non-card version of this, I think, which just involved the drinking and the talking.
Yeah. You know, Chris, you've featured in your advertisements many fine projects, but I think I can deeply and sincerely get behind this one in a way I perhaps never have been able to before.
Yeah, as a Pisces, none of them has spoke to you more on like a soul level than this
exactly.
This sponsorship.
The ocean within.
Channel your inner Bacchus.
So the Zodiac Buzzed drinking card game was created by Zach Thomas and Deja Lewis during the course of the pandemic. So it's a really interesting thing in terms of astrologers, sitting around working on things during the course of the pandemic and starting to see things emerge over the course of now that we're getting towards the end of it. And they're going to launch a Kickstarter campaign on March 3rd, 2020. So initial backers will have the opportunity to reserve one of 500 exclusive Zodiac Buzz special edition packaging and 4 exclusive shot glasses that are set to celebrate the company's first game launch and for those that want to found and sort of back this as a new project. So you can find out more information, or you can sign up for the Kickstarter at drunkendex.com. And it seems like a really awesome project. So I'm hoping people will support it and check it out. And I'll put a link to their website in the description page for this episode, either below this video on YouTube or at theastrologypodcast.com for this episode. So we are about an hour into this episode, and we've only talked about approximately the first 2 or 3 days of March. So why don't we move on? I mean, we've moved around a little bit.
I think you're being unfair to us, Chris. These are all month-long themes for the most part, or most of them are.
Yeah, Austin. Right. I'm with Austin. Okay.
Well, let's jump into looking at the rest of the month. So as I said, just a couple of days after that new moon, we have the Sun-Jupiter conjunction, which takes place on March 4th. So that's very similar energy in terms of some of the things we're discussing previously. Then on March 6th, we have Venus and Mars finally changing signs. Venus finally getting out of Capricorn, where it's just been like sitting in that sign for what seems like forever, since
November.
Since November. So Venus finally emerging and moving into Aquarius, and that's a major shift of energy, not just for Venus, but also for Mars on March 6th. We get the second of those 2 conjunctions at that time. So that's big. We've already talked about that a little bit in terms of the shift into Aquarius, and people really wanting to pay attention then to the Aquarius sector of their charts, really getting much more activated then this month. And whatever house that falls in, especially whatever whole sign house, from my perspective, becoming much more active as Venus and Mars ingress into that sign. What is our next thing after that? After that, we have Mercury ingressing into Pisces on March 10th. So a little bit of a shift, and again, emphasizing more of the Pisces energy in the second 2/3 of the month, not too long after the Sun-Jupiter conjunction. Mercury in Pisces, while it may be less focused on being detail-oriented and getting the specifics right, I think it's better at conveying something with emotion and something with sort of a poetry, and that being sort of what's important. And there can be a real elegance to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and big picture. This is a particularly effective addition of Mercury in Pisces, because in Pisces, Mercury is trying to articulate Jupiter things and trying to think through Jupiter things, and Jupiter's right there, right? So, Mercury doesn't have to phone a friend, right? Like the ruler of the sign is right there. I think we'll get, best case scenario out of as far as Mercury and Pisces stuff goes.
Yeah, and we'll eventually get a conjunction of those two, of Mercury and Jupiter on March 20th, and then Mercury and Neptune just a few days later on March 23rd. So backing up though.
One thing I wanted to just discuss a little bit is Venus's journey over the last couple months, and I'll be brief. So Venus did the retrograde, right, into the underworld and back again. And then usually there's sort of a breath of fresh air in Venus land, in the gardens, once we're done with the retrograde. But this time Mars was right there, and Venus is slow. Mars catches up to Venus and says, we're going to travel together for a while. And we're still in that, until early, until the first week of March, you get the conjunction, and then Venus is like, okay, I'm finally going to pull away and get to do my own thing. And I'm headed towards Pisces. Jupiter's there. We're gonna have a great time. But before that, like, Saturn stands in the way, and so Venus and Mars make that conjunction, and Venus finally starts to pull ahead. But Venus is in this rough place for a lot of the month, where ahead is Saturn and behind is Mars, right? Like getting a little bit more distance from the rock, but ahead the hard place looms. And especially towards the end of the month, which Chris is showing on the screen now, we have Venus really sandwiched between Saturn and Mars, which again it's very difficult for anything Venusian, right? Insofar as Venus is diplomats, negotiators, peacemakers, right? It's very difficult to negotiate between Saturn and Mars, right? They're archetypally quite ill-tempered, and so Venus will eventually break free and then get to do one of the best runs through Pisces ever. But we're really, the skies are really making Venus earn it.
Yeah, and even just Venus in relationships and relational dynamics, whether romantic or whether, platonic in terms of friendships or even business relationships, there is this sense of constraint. And while Venus may be coming out of the turbulenceness and rockiness of those conjunctions with Mars, and sort of escaping from some of the divisiveness of that, there's still this restraint and this sort of coldness that we're experiencing most of March, as Venus is building up to that conjunction with Saturn that eventually goes exact on the 28th. So it's still kind of like difficult for relationship dynamics much of the month until we get after that part and get after March 28th, once Venus clears both of the malefics of Mars and Saturn and clears that enclosure or besiegement, and then eventually moves into its sign of exaltation of Pisces early next month and begins heading towards that really optimistic and really positive conjunction with Jupiter.
So what you're saying is basically she's leaving the Jane Austen novel and she gets to get naked in Pisces.
I mean, yeah, there may be some clothes shedding in Pisces, but we're not quite there yet. And it might be time to keep the winter coat on during the course of most of March.
You're still having your tete-a-tete with Mr. Darcy.
Yeah, there's going to be no shoes, no pants, no service while Venus is with Saturn.
Yeah, and one of the things I know, Christopher, that you really pointed out, and I'm glad that you did, is that before Venus even gets to Saturn, both Venus and Mars have to first square Uranus. And I think that's one of our flashpoint sort of dynamic aspects that's occurring this month, when some major fireworks will probably take place, is first on, it looks like March 19th, when Venus first squares Uranus at 12 degrees of Taurus to 12 degrees of Aquarius. So we first have the energy of a Venus-Uranus square. And then just a few days later, it looks like March 22nd, we get the Mars-Uranus square. So why don't we talk first about Venus-Uranus square on March 19th, within the context of that being like the interim between two otherwise difficult aspects of the conjunction with Mars earlier in the month and then the conjunction with Saturn. So Venus is already between a rock and a hard place, but then it squares Uranus right here in the middle of the month.
Who she owns, right? Uranus is in Taurus. That's Venus's sign. That's Venus's card that she gets to take out of the opponent's hand. Okay, so she owns that Uranus. Uranus is very volatile. Okay, and you know, if you go back with Uranus lore and literature and everything, you know, it's always volatility. But the thing is, Uranus is also reversals, surprise reversals. And we often can think of reversals as being negative things, like it's not playing out the way that I expected, but we haven't, and sometimes it doesn't play out the way you expect, and sometimes that's a miserable result. But it can also not play out the way that you expected. And that can actually be an advantage. You know, it might put you in a better position than you were before. And, you know, I also work archetypally, I guess, is a way of saying it. But in my understanding, okay, Venus and Uranus get each other. She erupts from his orgasm after he's castrated. Okay, she erupts and she appears out of that. You know, I mean, like, a love goddess is born of an orgasm, okay? And she's born of Uranus. So there is a connection between those two, if you're looking, you know, mythologically or archetypally. But I think that this might be a break and then a re-break. You know, it might be a break, but it might be a reversal that could, I'm looking for it to definitely throw in a plot twist or an element that wasn't expected. Okay. Something that I was thinking, Austin, as you were talking about Venus's journey towards Capricorn, I think it's Paul Krugman in the New York Times was saying, you know, that what Putin was offering Ukraine was a marriage proposal. You know, marry me or I'll kill you was how Krugman put it. You know, and so that was very much that kind of energy that you were describing. And so this might be a reversal or a break. That introduces an unknown element that changes the rules of the game. I mean, Uranus, in the way that I've worked with him, often changes the rules of the game. You think it's being played one way, and then all of a sudden it switches to something altogether different. And so that's going to be interesting. I think the square to Venus is going to be very different from the square to Mars because Venus owns that Uranus. Uranus is playing in a house that she owns, and or in a sign that she owns, whereas Mars isn't.
Yeah, so let's give some keywords for Venus Uranus. I mean, that's one of the things is it can be a very exciting combination between Venus and Uranus. Unexpected developments in relationships, and sometimes that can be very exciting in terms of the new dynamics that it introduces, and the excitement of a new relationship can sometimes sort of sweep people away unexpectedly and going in directions that you might not have planned otherwise, or changing your day-to-day routine in a way that seems new and appealing and sort of...
Or it's on again, off again, or it's on again, off again, on again, off again. You don't, you know, if you're talking about a relationship, you don't really know how it's playing out with the other person, you know, and so that can also introduce a lot of excitement in terms of that. Anguish, but excitement as well.
And so this is coming off of the passion and the intensity of the Venus-Mars conjunction earlier and the Venus-Pluto-Mars conjunction a little bit before that. So we have those other elements of passion, intensity, but then change and unexpected disruptions and newness and innovation and relational dynamics here with the square before eventually this sort of soberness sets in when Venus catches up to Saturn later in the month on the 28th. What are some of your Venus square Uranus sort of keywords, Austin, whether you're thinking about it as a transit or natally?
So, okay, a couple of things. One, what Uranus brings to Venus that's not there necessarily otherwise is a need for independence, for relationship to not compromise personal sovereignty. Right, that Venus-Uranus pairing is like, oh, I want to hang out, but, you know, I'm not going to marry you, or I'm not going to commit to a structure, right? There's a real need, especially in natives, to like maintain sovereignty while still relating to people. Some of what you were saying, you know, as a transit, It brings novel pleasures. A great way to work with it is don't do what you normally do for pleasure, right? Like normally I like to go to this restaurant on this day. We have like go-tos. How should we say, experiencing or discovering a novel joy, like a new kind of fun, going somewhere else different, doing something that you don't do. If you're in a relationship, not just going to the same old thing. It can also highlight things that need to change in a relationship. It's like, Uranus is just like the need for change. It's like, well, we've talked about this from time to time, but like Uranus can also make things, bring things to a head where it's like, no, this really needs to change, right? Or you need to change, or I need to change, or we need to change. But, Uranus brings that change in, which does certainly challenge the Venusian priority of harmony. So those are a couple things.
Yeah, I like that. Those are all really good keywords.
Yeah, I think also makeup to breakup or breakup to makeup would be very much a Venus-Uranus square.
What do you mean by that?
We break up and then we make up again, or we're making up, but I can't stand you, and so we're going to break up again. There can be this back and forth. I'm not sure where this relationship is going type of thing, because Uranus in Taurus has been making, if you're talking about a relationship being affected or whatever, Uranus in Taurus has already been an erratic or hard to figure out where this relationship thing is going anyway. And so Venus is probably trying to figure out how to turn it into a relationship, or how to turn it into something more consistent because of the fixity in Aquarius. But Uranus is shaking up, whatever consistency you would have in Taurus, So again, I would imagine a lot of we're on again, off again. I wouldn't be surprised if people are going back to relationships they swore they would never go back to, or if it can be the return of someone from the past. I know that was brought up with Venus retrograde, but Uranus is a wheel. Okay, revolution is not just the overthrow of a government, but revolution is also the completion of a planet's orbit around the sun. So what's gone around once could be coming around again with this type of a square, and that might be upsetting, one of the people involved in that relationship. Like, I can't believe you're back again, but I love someone else, and how can I be with you? And now I have my chance to be with you. So those sorts of dilemmas and upsets could very well be brought up during this period of time. And also sudden changes in a partner's financial status, obviously. Maybe the partner's suddenly really successful, and then you're questioning whether you're on equal standing, or the partner goes through a financial downward spiral, and then, you might have to take on more. So there's going to be some scrimmaging that's going on with this.
Yeah, and I like what you said about a quickness, because Uranus brings a quickness and quickens the pace of things, especially in relational dynamics, and things can change suddenly and unexpectedly, but just speed up and go much quicker than you're used to in terms of the sequence and pace of things. And sometimes things get out of order in that usually take longer, can sometimes be condensed down into very short time frames. And that's kind of important here, because then the contrast at the end of the month is suddenly things slow down when Venus catches up with Saturn. And there's this contrast between the middle of the month here with Venus hitting Uranus and this quickness of the pace of things versus things slowing down later in the month and starting to think things through and have questions about, is this the right decision, or am I moving too fast, and other things like that. But before we get there, we have this other aspect that quickens the pace of things, which is Mars just a few days later also meets up with Uranus and squares it on March 22nd. So it's very much tied in with the same sort of sequence of speeding things up and actions that are taken sometimes impulsively, sometimes erratically, but perhaps due to like passion or due to a drive to accomplish or achieve something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, both Venus and Mars get this shot from Uranus, this little lightning infusion, and it shakes things up, but on their way to Saturn, right? And they all have to do that interview, that like sober moment, about whatever the deal is after getting excited or scared or whatever combination thereof with Uranus. But then it's time to like sit down, and read the fine print with Saturn and be like, oh, that isn't possible. Right. Or, you know what, we can do this. But, from that careful, strategic, just the facts, Saturnian perspective.
Hmm.
Yeah, needing to read the fine print in the contract and make the sort of agreement at that point. So this is one of our aspects. It's kind of tied in a little bit with an aspect that's one of our most notable ones later this year, I think in July or August, when there's this interesting triple conjunction of Mars, Uranus, and the North Node that takes place in Taurus. And I know that's one of the ones that we focused on a lot later this year, but this is interestingly kind of tied in with that because this is the square of Mars to Uranus that kind of precedes that in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So are there any other Mars-Uranus keywords that might be good just to give delineations, to give people an idea of that archetype?
I think everyone's kind of tired of Mars cranky pants, type of thing. And so what I kind of could see being here is a surprise upset. Like we've seen this in the Olympics recently where it's like, so-and-so was supposed to win that gold, but you know what? The performance wasn't so great, or you had a meltdown, or you didn't come through. And so I could sort of see an upset in such a way in which Mars had something targeted that's upset. Okay. And then when Austin was talking about that cooling off period, it may be sort of like, well, you didn't get everything you wanted to, but, because this score is higher over here. And so we're just going to have to like settle down with that and accept that, and I could see Mars being very like, whatever about that. So because there's such a distinct change of disposition from Capricorn to Aquarius, and this Uranian element is really throwing in that surprise twist, and I could see that playing out with Mars. That Mars's expectations might be reversed, or I don't want to use thwarted because that's more of a Saturn thing, but they might be reversed or upset in some sort of way, and then there's that kind of final verdict being issued by Saturn. Well, this is the end result. This is the end score. This is what. Not everyone's going to like it, but this is what everyone's going to have to live with when they pass under the beams of Saturn.
Yeah, I like that phrasing of upset. It makes me think of upsets in combat sports, right? Where you have, like, for example, no one ever expected Buster Douglas to beat Mike Tyson, right? Mike Tyson was the scariest and most effective fighter in the world for years. And somebody most people never heard of, like, beat him. And so you have those, and it's always shocking, and people lose a lot of money, right? Because in one-on-one sports, you got big betting markets, right? It's like, oh, that was 10-1 odds. And so some people make a huge amount of money, right? Whereas most people are like, I'll just bet on the champ. He doesn't lose ever. So like that sort of overturning expectations, upset victory. On the negative level, Mars Uranus will it can be a freak out energy, because Mars is already little bit of a tinderbox, and then you hit it with Uranian lightning and just goes up all at once. And that's unfortunately also structurally true with buildings and things in the world, but it's also true of structures in within the hearts, and people are like, I just can't take it anymore, just freaking out. Another thing that a more positive thing that Mars Uranus is associated with is sometimes you see just like sort of next level overwhelming power, like a super weapon. This is maybe not the most positive example, but we had the nuclear weapons being dropped for the first time with a Mars Uranus conjunction. That was like, that it was sort of, okay, there's no longer a contest. One side is just like has an entirely different level of power. Sometimes you see that completely overwhelming power.
Yeah. So unexpected sort of explosions can sometimes be either metaphorically or sometimes very literally a Mars-Uranus combination.
Yeah, well, and just to use that example, unfortunately, that's sort of game changing. It's like, oh, I thought we were playing this game, and suddenly there's a new move, and it changes the game, right? I very often think of Uranus as like flipping the game board, right? You know, everybody's playing Monopoly, and then Uranus just like, I don't know, throws the table over, and it's like everything goes everywhere. It's like, oh, I guess we're not playing Monopoly anymore. It's not like lawyering around rules, right?
Except for the Capricorns who have memorized everyone's Monopoly positions on the board and are collecting all the pieces and putting them back where they were before.
And important to mention, and I haven't been showing the illustrations that Zartana made us this month for the weekly astrology, so I just want to show that really quick. But these aspects that we're talking about right now take place very close to our second lunation of the month, which is a full moon in Virgo that occurs on March 18th. So I just want to mention that lunation really quickly because it has some interesting configurations that are all going exact as we're hitting the moon being at her fullest and brightest during this part of the month around the 18th, when things are already reaching a sort of climax. We also have some of these aspects going exact at that time. Venus squaring Uranus exact the next day, and then Mars squaring Uranus just a few days after that. So this is, in some ways, kind of like the highlight or the climax of the month in terms of tenseness and in terms of some of those tense energies.
Yeah, I also wonder about, I mean, isn't it trining the lunar eclipse from last November?
I'm not sure. Maybe in Taurus, yeah.
Yeah, that was at like 26, I think.
26 or 27, right? Wasn't it? Yeah. So that might be interesting for people whose charts were affected or impacted by that lunar eclipse. This could almost work as a denouement or something like that, something in which they don't see the result, but they see the thing that follows the result of what might have happened during that period of time.
Yeah. One of the things that makes me a little nervous about the Mars-Uranus square and some of the explosive energy we were just talking about that occurs on the 22nd is that immediately after that, the very next day, Mercury conjoins Neptune. So it's like something sort of explosive happens, but then all of a sudden there's almost like confusion or a sort of deceptive or illusory element that peaks at the same time in terms of, talking about and discussing what just happened, and there may be a lack of clarity or an attempt to have some sort of deception surrounding it. So maintaining clarity of communication will be one of the challenges, but something also that will be kind of important at this time around the 23rd.
Yeah, I'd like to say about the Virgo full moon, just in general, these happen once a year. And I think the themes are especially highlighted this year because of the sun's presence with Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces. So Pisces time is like, it's big dreams, big vision, like seeing things sort of slowly coagulating, the shape of like maybe something amazing or inspiring, coagulating out of all of the possibilities, like the dreams coming together. And then the moon always, the full moon's always opposed whatever the sun is doing. And the juxtaposition here is with the moon being full in Virgo and so what about all the details, right? So you can have a sense of a big thing. You might have an amazing idea, but it's like with Virgo, it's very much, how is this going to get done, right? Like what is the time frame when you break the project down into pieces? What does that look like? What kind of funds are required? Like, how are we going to actually do this? It's such a good question to ask when you're in the midst of your Jupiter-Neptune reverie. Because the thing is, there are sometimes people will be like, oh, I had this big dream, it didn't work out, so I guess that was a bad idea. What I see a lot of times is I see people who have a good idea, it's just that they didn't have the implementation, right? The implementation makes it a good, will make it look like a good idea in retrospect. And so that the full moon in Virgo is just asking for that piece.
It's a little bit more than that, Austin, because the sun and the moon are in conversation with Pluto. The moon is trining Pluto and the sun is sextiling it. So it's not just like a washed out bridge between that point. There's access to resources and there are to-do steps because you've got a planet that's intervening, that's getting these two opposites to actually be in conversation or collaboration with one another.
Well, and you have Mercury and Jupiter conjoined during this. You have the rulers of Pisces and Virgo in conjunction at the moon. So or not at the moon, during the full moon. And so there's some like as you put it, Christopher, it's not a washed out bridge. Like you can what is the rainbow bridge between the human realms and the realm of
Asgard,
the gods?
the rainbow bridge of Asgard.
There's the rainbow bridge, right, which connects the realms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Then eventually we're starting to get towards the end of the month here when Venus eventually catches up with Saturn on the 28th. Mercury also the day before moved into Aries, and this was actually preceded by the ingress of the sun on the 20th into Aries. So we have our vernal equinox, or we have the beginning of the spring season in the northern hemisphere when the sun moves into Aries. Any special thoughts about that as we move out of the sort of winter season in the northern hemisphere and move into basically the beginning of the spring season with the sun in its exaltation?
Could you bring that chart up, Chris?
Yeah. You have a sun in exaltation, which is ruled by Mars, which squares Uranus 2 days later.
So, as you both know, there's a very long tradition of using this moment of the sun's ingress into Aries to do forecasting about, mundane events, about what happens in the world for the next year. And so to a certain degree, this chart is extra important because a lot of the configurations which are occurring at this moment get locked in and have, they get locked in. They're sort of seeds that are sprinkled all over the world. And so it's really interesting, especially this year, because we have a very tight Mercury-Jupiter, yay, but we have poor Venus sandwiched between Saturn and Mars. And so the dynamics that we're seeing here that we've been talking about for most of the podcast also get coded into the yearly chart. And so I think that's just worth noting.
Yeah. I don't see Venus as, she's sandwiched between, but I don't see it as being all that. She's sandwiched between, yes, but I don't see it as being completely dreary. I think that, but I can't explain that intelligently yet.
Sure. Well, it's certainly the Venus-Uranus square is still very close at that point. So the desire in Venus to break free of some of the restrictions that she may be experiencing might be, very intense as well.
Or making use of the accidents. This is something we don't always. This is something we don't always think about is useful accidents. That someone had brought up before. The idea of the plot twist. And she's playing such a strong role in that plot twist. So I think there's a trump card. There's a surprise card that may be played right then at that point.
Right. Yeah. All right. So that is our ingress. And what's interesting at this point is, and the thing that I kept thinking when I was preparing for this episode and thinking about the month of March, is that March is kind of ends on like a nail biter. It kind of ends on a cliffhanger or a to be continued at the end of the month, like you're watching a television show. Like I've been watching like Euphoria recently. I don't know if either of you watch it, but it's really good. But it's one of those ones where each week it just like leaves you on this cliffhanger and like wondering what's going to happen in the next episode, because you can see it building up and you can see all the different threads that are weaving in order to culminate in something important. But in order to keep you watching, sometimes they just end like right at the moment where you think the thing is going to happen, but then it doesn't. And I feel like this month has a little bit of that quality, because the two most important aspects that are building up during the course of March don't actually come to completion by the end of the month, but instead they wait until early April to do that. And one of the aspects that's building up and getting super close by the end of the month is the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which will go exact around April 9th. So we're left on kind of a cliffhanger towards the end of the month because two of the most important aspects that are building up most of March and that we're getting this sense of and are becoming more and more intense, which is on the one hand, the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces, and then on the other hand, the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. Both of those don't go exact until early April, so they don't reach the height or the peak of their intensity until early next month. And in that way, I feel like even though we see the threads and the directions that some of these events and some of these energies are taking, by the end of March, we're kind of left on a to be continued note where we don't reach the final culmination of both of those until next month.
Strongly agree with that.
That's astrology.
Right. That's something you're used to doing horoscopes, like weekly and monthly horoscopes, is you're always sort of
daily.
Some of that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, always. It's why I love telenovelas so much because they bring it to the cliffhanger and right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's something that's hard actually also for people to understand about retrogrades, especially when you're heading into a retrograde, is so often retrogrades are difficult to understand because they don't represent a singular event, but instead they represent a sequence of events that will unfold over the course of a retrograde. And sometimes once you get to the end of it, like for example, we're getting to the end of this Venus retrograde period, once it leaves its shadow in March, you can look back and see that whole sequence of events and how it emerged or unfolded over the course of that time, that period of time in your life. But right at the beginning, it's sometimes hard to identify like what is the singular event because it's not a singular event; it's a sequence of them.
Right, and again, it's hindsight is 20/20. You know, and Saturn is the planet of time, and it's looking back over your shoulder to see how all of that played out. Because we live the way that we live is that we're always anticipating the next event, like what you were talking about watching your Euphoria show. You know, we're living for that next type of thing. We don't always remember, what had taken place before. And retrogrades can be like time release capsules. You know, the events are released gradually over a period of time. And so they don't really carry that wow impact. But when you go back and look over it, they carry impact. You're just like, wow, with having seen the way that they play out.
Yeah, you can see the results of the cycle. And, it's often not terribly difficult to guess what the output will be ahead of time, but the pathway to get to that is often much harder to predict. Like, well, Venus is going to spend 4 months in this house. Like that, we can guess what it was like. I guess very accurately what my Venus retrograde would be about. But I was still, I was surprised. I didn't know exactly when, like how I would be led to have that experience that would have that output. Like, because again, like as a whole from a distance, not that hard to get the shape of it, but once you're in it, it's different. Right. And the actual, it's like the actual structure of the various tunnels in the rooms you'll be in and what happens is, I think, much more mysterious.
Yeah. So could we briefly, as we're getting towards wrapping up here, just give a few keywords for, we've talked about this in the year ahead forecast, but I just want to give a few keywords for one, the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius that's building up most of March and culminates in early April, and then the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction that weirdly is happening almost simultaneously, goes exact almost simultaneously in early April, but is really building up during the course of much of March. What sort of distinction does that lead to? Because it's so different. It's like we have on the one hand a very tense physical sort of aspect with Mars-Saturn conjunction. And the last time we had one of these was back in around April of 2020, when most of the world was in the early phases of the pandemic and especially the lockdowns. And the experience of that for many people was, being stuck inside suddenly and wanting to go outside or wanting to interact with other people, wanting to go back to work or what have you, but having this sort of physical restraint of being stuck inside and not having the freedom of movement that most of us were used to. So in some ways here we have like a return of a similar archetypal energy of movement being restricted in some ways, seemingly But then at the same time, we also have Jupiter-Neptune conjunction taking place, which is almost like the opposite energy of having this boundlessness and this lack of restrictions and the sense of optimism or things freeing up. So one of the questions we talked about in the last forecast was most of the last two Mars-Saturn alignments have coincided with new variants, which either started to emerge at that time of the Mars-Saturn alignment or started to become known shortly after that time, and whether this Mars-Saturn conjunction would coincide with something similar, and whether it's the start of something new. But also more optimistically, we're hoping that it's also the closing down of that almost 2.5 year Mars-Saturn cycle that we've all been experiencing during the course of the pandemic over the past 2 years, and maybe some aspects of that coming to an end.
Mm-hmm.
What's your feelings about Mars-Saturn? How are you feeling about Mars-Saturn at this point, Austin?
Okay, well, let me go back to just the feeling tone of it, because you asked some very big questions. So Mars-Saturn is frustrating, right? You want to do something, but there's something in the way, especially in a case where Saturn has more strength, right? If Mars has more strength, then, Saturn is a speed bump. But in this case, Saturn is absolutely in control. And so Mars will want to do things and go fast, and, enact things that are going to be denied, right? In the period around the conjunction. Like, it'll be frustrating from a Mars point of view. And so there's that. It's one of the analogies you've used a lot is Saturn is the brakes and Mars is the gas, right? Which puts you in a not going anywhere, but spending a lot of energy not going anywhere, which is frustration, right?
Right.
So there's that. Mars-Saturn also, when you can get them working together, is slow moving, but completely relentless, right? Between Mars and Saturn, you have the capacity to handle, both the quick moving, aggressive challenges of Mars and the slower moving, but equally difficult challenges of Saturn. And when, both of those are combined as a mode of action or as a virtue, you have just total relentlessness. Like, to go back to the Terminator, right? Just like still coming. Like, I thought we blew him up. I thought we shot him, like just still coming. And, if you can, if you have some Mars-Saturn stuff in your chart, there's a mode of clicking into just being relentless, which I think is one of the more positive outcomes. Not in hunting down Sarah Connor and her unborn son, but in pursuing your goals and not letting anything stop you.
I like the idea that the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius is like the T-1000, the Terminator that's sent from the future. I'll keep that imagery this month. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I was watching clips the other day, and it's the way that they portray the relentlessness is really emotionally effective. It's like, oh God, still coming. So be that.
Right.
But not at people, at goals.
I have a different take on that. I think that Aquarius at the end of the day is an air sign, and air signs at the end of the day are law and order. They rule over relationships. They rule over the way that you're going to get along with another person. Relationships can be amorous or relationships can be enforced. I think that when you have Saturn and Mars coming together, it strikes me as a very absolutist because of the fixity. It can be very heavy-handed. And I think it's going to be coming down on the side of law and order. It's going to be coming down on the side of this is the, no more nice guy. This is the way that things are going to be done. And I think Saturn is actually going to be directing Mars in that regard. Mars wants to be a good soldier, and Saturn in Aquarius can be a good general. And I think that so that emphasis on heavy-handed, this is the way it's going to be done, no ifs, ands, or buts. And we've seen the evolution of that, in responses to whether it's the January 6th Commission or whether it's the response to what went on in Canada with the truckers. There's this kind of split that's taking place between, government of the people and government, type of thing. And I think that on this hand, Saturn's going to be very heavy-handed and very directed about it, and Mars is going to be servicing that. What I think is interesting, because these conjunctions don't take place out of nowhere. On the other hand, you have this very mystical Jupiter-Neptune conjunction taking place. And we talk about mysticism and magic and things like that. But what you can also have with very strong Neptune is paranoia, conspiracy theories, secrets, all these sorts of things. And Aquarius has always been traditionally associated to science, a very rational, very scientific view of things. And it's also associated to the Enlightenment, which is, government of the people, by the people. And these are the principles. With Pisces, it's kind of like mysticism and science have not always been on the best behavior with one another. They're not always on really good speaking terms. And so, and often that kind of Piscean energy can be described as irrational or crazy. And so I think what's starting to maybe emerge here is that as there's more of an emphasis on perhaps the Saturn-Mars, law and justice, and this is rational, and this is the way it's going to be done, there's going to be more of a resistance on the Piscean part of, you can't tell me what to believe. I have these experiences that are not going to be denied or pigeonholed or condescended to, because there can be a rebellious streak to Pisces as well. Mystics are not incorporated in religious institutions. They're actually two separate species. So I think that, we could see a fission rather than fusion between the spiritual and the scientific. It's an argument that's already going on. And I think it's going to become more pronounced during this period of time. And it might not be so much a conflict as it might be an insistence on pick your side. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of law and order and this is the way things are going to be done? Or are you on the side of, this is my personal experience and this is my connection to what's going on here, and I have the right to do this and you can't take that away from me? So I could see a sort of pick your sides thing that's emerging with this kind of juxtaposition of these conjunctions, if we can put that into a sentence in that sort of way. So that's how I would see that, really upping the frequency of that.
Nice. And I think what I'll say is just one thing I'd like to reiterate is that this is the second and the last Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And the first one, again, was back in early 2020, in the first and second quarter of 2020. So for many people, it's going to be just reviving and bringing up some issues that you've already dealt with in the Aquarius sector of your chart, especially whatever whole sign house that falls. But hopefully this time around, as those issues come up and some of those tensions or frustrations come up, you'll be better prepared to deal with them if you just remember what happened last time and think about the most sort of graceful or productive way to address some of those issues during the course of the second version of that transit. And secondarily, to look to the Pisces sector of your chart for an area of sort of growth and optimism and new beginnings, with the Jupiter transit through Pisces that culminates with the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction early next month. But to think of some of the keywords of sort of like faith and wanting to import a sort of either mystical or creative, but some sort of need to believe in something like higher or bigger than yourself as being something that can sometimes be useful. And while somewhat distracting, it can be a positive distraction that's sort of necessary in order to pull you forward into the future and in order to help create or manifest something that is more ideal and in terms of in keeping with what the best or most positive best case scenario is that you'd like to see happen in your life. And now would be the time to try to bring some of that about while Jupiter is transiting through that sector of your chart during this brief span of time before it departs and moves into Aries.
Yeah, I would agree. There's whatever the Pisces area is. And Cancer is also, and whatever part of the chart is Cancer, is also getting a lot from that, because Cancer is getting all these trines from the Pisces stuff, and is off aspect to any of the Aquarius stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was going through the month, I was just looking at the moon in each sign. It was like, oh, that couple days is all about the Pisces stuff. Oh, that couple days is all about the Aquarius stuff. This next couple days is both at once, right? Like Scorpio, for example, gets a square from all the Aquarius stuff at the same time as a trine from all of the Pisces stuff. There really are, you were speaking earlier about like the Pisces column and the Aquarius column. There really are these two very distinct influences. And each sign is either getting one or the other, or both. And there's just a huge difference between the, I like how you described Mars-Saturn as very heavy-handed, Christopher. I think, heavy-handed authoritarian is how it will look, in the news, but it's also, it's a very, as a transit, it's a very down to brass tacks, no illusions. You need to do what needs to be done, and it might not be fun, but it's just got to happen. Whereas the Pisces side, as you were saying, Chris, it's imaginative. It's opening up to huge possibilities, right? It's, connecting, deepening, opening, imagining, in a sense, the what to do with, is very much the opposite in each case, where it's like, close it, like, narrow your focus to what needs to be done with Saturn Mars, and then hugely dilate the lens, open way up in the Pisces area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that Pisces is very, very creative. I mean it's if you're involved in any sort of creative arts or media or anything like that, I mean this is an extraordinary time when that division between the conscious and the unconscious mind is actually lowered, and the waters of inspiration are really sort of seeping over them into what could be a very conscious activization of it. So this isn't a time for like, oh, I'm going to visualize and say a mantra. This is the time to like get up and do. The resources are available. If you remember that full moon in Virgo with the trines and the sextiles, that the bridge isn't washed out. And so take advantage of that huge wave of creativity that's going to be moving through your horoscopes, and actually produce a result, because you've got those aspects that are going on with Pluto in Capricorn, and Earth signs always want a result.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, if we're characterizing the nature of this Jupiter, Pisces, Neptune influence, it's, I think of in that Pisces as a water sign, it's sort of a divine rain, like like what you put down, has the or is going to have the advantage of getting fertilized by, or fertilized, fecundated, nurtured by a very particular and heady brew of Jupiter-Neptune, right? It's like psychedelic super rain.
Yeah, I love that. All right. I think that's going to leave us, that really brings us to the end of the month and leaves us on that cliffhanger of all of the energies we just described building up, but eventually culminating in early April. So we'll have to save the rest of that discussion for our next forecast, which is going to be one of the more dynamic months of the year once we get to April. But I don't want to give away, what happens in the next episodes. So we'll have to leave it there. Thanks, both of you, for joining me today. This is a lot of fun. Thanks, Christopher, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it and appreciate it. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you here. This was fun.
It was so much fun to see you again. Yeah.
So where can people find out more information about your work, and what do you have coming up?
You can go to my website, which is rulingplanets.com. And there, as Chris mentioned at the beginning of the show, I have a book out that's been out for a little bit called Cosmic Calendar, and I have a Cosmic Calendar workshop. Thank you. I don't know where mine is, but anyway, I have a Cosmic Calendar workshop that's being produced by Astrology Hub. That's good. I can see it's Yeah, it's 3 weeks online, and it's March 3rd, I think it starts. Anyway, you can go to my website and click on that, and it's basically how to turn your astrology chart into a personal calendar, not a personal agenda, but a personal calendar. Each of us has a chart that sets our own rhythm and timing in life that works with the transits rather than just being assaulted by the transits. And this is something that you're going to learn over the course of the 3-week workshop.
Brilliant. So your website is rulingplanets.com.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rulingplanets.com.
Cool. And I'll put a link to that in the description below this video on YouTube or on the Astrology Podcast website so people can find it. Austin, what do you have coming up?
The lovely Venus in Libra series that I elected and Kate created is finally out, I believe, as of 24 hours ago. So that's available at Sphere and Sundry. And then next up is going to be a Deneb El-Gedi project, which was catching Jupiter right on that star last year. That's probably not by the end of March, but coming up next. And then for me, I finally got my new year 1 classes launched on the 17th. I limited the number of people that could enroll so it didn't get chaotic. So that filled up pretty quickly, but I'm going to open it up again, either end of March, early April. So if people wanted to study with me and missed out on that, it's not closed for a year. I'm going to open back up again. And if you want to make sure to get on that, join the mailing list. I just did a private sort of release to the mailing list and my Patreon before going public, and then it sold out before I needed to go public. So if you want to make sure to catch it, just sign up for the mailing list.
Brilliant. And your website is austincoppock.com?
Indeed.
Cool. All right. As for myself, I'm just going to be focusing on the podcast, focusing on finding a new editor and getting into some great episodes. I'm planning on starting a new series on the podcast where we do a deep dive into each sign of the zodiac, starting with the sign of Aries, which I'm talking to Rick Levine about doing the first episode on soon.
Right.
So Aries, my Aries stellium. I tried to think of an astrologer that had good Aries placements, and I could not. He's got like 4 or 5 planets in Aries. So what can you do?
Podcast with Rick Levine is what you can do on Aries.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I'll be doing. If you enjoy the podcast and you get a lot of the episodes and you'd like to help support it, help support me to, hire a new editor and everything else, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com/astrology podcast. And there's different membership levels where you can get access to bonus content like early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast episodes like this one, the Auspicious Elections podcast, or even an exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast. Or on our top tier, you can get a producer credit where your name gets listed at the end of each episode of the Astrology Podcast. So you can find that at patreon.com/astrology podcast. And I think that's it for this episode. So thanks a lot, guys, for joining me. This is really fun today.
Thank you.
This is great.
All right. And thanks to our audience for joining us. We got love you in the chat. Everybody, please be sure to leave a comment and let us know what you think of the forecast and some of the alignments that we're talking about this month and how you've seen them manifest in your life, especially leaving a comment on YouTube or liking this video. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks a lot for watching or listening, and we'll see you again next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Coppock, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly Auspicious Elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrology podcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at hellenisticastrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.